Hello and welcome everyone to this episode of Triggered and True with myself, Brian Friese, and the one and only Miss Laura Duncan. Hello, Laura.
Hi, Brian. Hi, everyone.
So I'm actually, today we're going to be talking about grief in the grieving process. And I'm actually really excited to do this, which sounds kind of strange to be excited to talk about grief. But I'm excited, Laura, because it's an opportunity for you to share your story and your own personal journey through grief in the grieving process at the loss of your husband, Jeff. And ultimately, it was your experience through that led to the development of the compassion method and to now you helping literally thousands and thousands. I was thinking of how many people you've helped in this area of emotional health as I was preparing for this, and I know it's thousands and thousands now. And your journey through that has led to development and helping so many others. So thank you for taking the time to share this with the world because people really need help in this area. And I think we need help because grief is obviously connected to profound pain. And as we've been talking about in this series, as human beings, we tend to avoid pain at all costs. We hide from it, we run from it, we numb it, we do whatever we can not to feel our pain. And I heard you share this just the other day and how that really robs us of the opportunity to provide comfort to ourselves and also robs us of the ability to discover more about who we are. And it also, I think for me personally, it robs, when I think about my experience through my own emotional health time and what I've called my great awakening, it robbed me from learning that I can be okay, even when it's not okay all around me.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah. And the way you define okay is being clear minded, tender hearted, and at peace. And I recognize I had spent so much of my life investing energy into trying to get my external world okay so that I could be okay inside. And we all know how futile that is because how much control do we really have over our external world? And as it pertains to grief, I recognize that I spent a lot of time in fear of potential grief sources and how much that robbed me of being okay. And I can't tell you how much hope that gave me when you first started sharing that with me, and it was really profound. So as we talk about grief, I think it's also important to recognize that grief. A lot of times when we think of grief, we think of someone dies, and that's a lot of your story. But grief is actually some pain we experience at any type of loss. So we'll be talking more about this as we go, but I think it's important to just expand people's perspective of grief going into it because some people might be thinking, well, I haven't lost a loved one or anybody really close to me, thankfully. So I don't know how this conversation of grief really impacts me, but grief is really any loss, right? You want to just expound on that a little bit before we get started?
Yeah, like you said, it feels like it's only death that you're really going to experience profound grief. But loss is grief. Loss produces grief, and we all have loss in our life, and it comes in different packages. And we really like to measure pain. So if you've had, with my husband dying, that's a really big pain. But maybe somebody lost a job, and that seems really small in comparison to such a big pain as my husband dying. But ultimately, loss is loss, pain is pain. There's not a measuring stick for it because all of us are going to process pain differently. And it could be more painful for someone to experience a minor loss than someone else experiencing a major loss, depending upon how they process it and what's going on inside of their hearts. And so you don't want to minimize any loss because when we do, we suppress it and we don't take care of it. And that's really important for us to do.
Anything else you want to share before I start asking you some questions and we start sharing a little bit more about your life story?
I just wanted to kind of agree with what you said in the beginning of I get really excited to share about this, just kind of like you said, ironic because it has a lot of sadness to it, pain to it. But I really am excited because I've been able to, learn so much. Like you said, this is where the compassion method was birthed from. And it became something that was so much bigger and more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. And so it's just a testimony on this side of loss, having it been 12 years now, on this side of loss, that there's so much hope, there's so much life, there's so much good that can come from something that at the time was just so difficult.
Well, I was wondering if you could just start off sharing a little bit about Jeff and your marriage and just kind of a little background there.
Yeah, so I'll kind of go through just how we met. We met through a mission organization, YWAM. Some people might be familiar with it. And we met, and funny enough, when we first met, we both were like, nope, we didn't like each other. And he had gotten hurt like the year before in a relationship. So he decided he was going to be like a monk or something. So girls were like completely, they were just a necessary evil to be around. They weren't not evil, but they were just like something you have to deal with. But he wasn't in a place that he wanted to be in a relationship. And then I was coming to YWAM. There's an acronym that people made up for YWAM. That's Young Women After Men. And I was so offended by it. And I was making those vows, like, I will not meet anyone in YWAM.
I have never heard that acronym that way before. So interesting.
Yeah. So YWAM, YWAM. And that's what people would joke around about. And I have siblings that like to tease me. So they had heard it before I went, and they were like, "Oh, you're going to go to YWAM and you're going to find a man." And I was just like, absolutely not. Because at the time I was very dedicated. I'm still dedicated to God, but I was very I was 19. I was really young. I was gung ho. I was going to go and change the world. And I didn't want to I wasn't there for a relationship. So obviously that didn't work out that way, because I did come home with a man. So I remember being so embarrassed by it that I would not want to tell anyone, because I didn't want that to happen. But I'm obviously very glad that it did happen. We went to China for 3 months. And during that time, we ended up getting to know each other, just because you're doing missions and it's, a lot more intense environment. So we ended up spending more time together in a group setting, but we were talking and connecting. And we ended up deciding that we were ultimately going to get married, because at that time as well, you didn't really date very much. It was just either you're getting married or you're not getting married. Looking back now, I'm like, wow, that was a really extreme process, but that's where we were at the time. We took a train on the way back when we were going to leave China. And we both decided we were going to pray during the train ride. We were going to decide if we were going to get married or not. And I was like, at the end of the train ride, we were like, we're going to get married. So again, I probably wouldn't do it the same way now, but in that youthful, following God way, that's what I decided to do. So we got married in 2000, and we ended up wanting to have kids right away. So we had our first child in 2001. We had our second in 2002. We had our third January of 2004. They're all 14 months apart. And then we had our last in 2006, and she was about 2 years apart. But we had 4 kids pretty much back to back. During that time, we also went down and started the first School of Supernatural Ministry through Bethel down in Mexico. So we lived in La Paz, Mexico for a year, and our third daughter was born down there. And so we just really had a lifestyle of faith. Jeff was always praying for healing. When we were down in Mexico, he would literally clear hospital floors. There'd be 6 to 8 beds on a floor, and he'd go in and pray for people, and all 6 to 8 people would be healed, and they would leave the hospital. And he just had this desire and belief that people could be physically healed, and he would stop in the middle of the street and pray for someone. So we came back from Mexico in 2005, I believe, and kind of went right into the American life. Jeff got a job at the post office. I was raising 4 kids at home. We were still serving God, but we were definitely doing it in a more conventional way at that time. And Jeff, again, he was never conventional. So he would work the job to earn money to be able to pay for the needs that we had, but he wasn't going to stop doing what he was going to do for God. And so he made this sign that said free prayer. And he would go park down at the bottom of the hospital, because our hospital is up on a hill. And he'd park at the bottom of the hospital, put a sign out after work, and pray for people for an hour or 2 hours. Not every day, but 2 or 3 times a week, because he couldn't be in ministry because of the commitment it would take with work and 4 small children. So instead, he just did it himself. And so he would pray for people. And it was really amazing to see such faith and for him to believe in healing so profoundly. So, and then in 2008 is when he first started having symptoms of Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS. And it's a nervous system disease where ultimately your nerve endings die. And so you can't move your muscles. And so it usually affects your limbs, and then eventually it affects your lungs because your lungs is a muscle as well. And so in 2008, he started to have symptoms of it. At first, we didn't know what it was. And we thought maybe it was just like a chiropractic issue. But as we started to do tests, all the tests came back perfect, which sounds great, but it's actually the worst because if they all come back perfect, then that means there's a bigger problem. And so we recognized it was a bigger problem. And in July of 2008, he had to stop working because it was debilitating his legs where he couldn't, walk and move to the degree he needed to be a post office worker. So he came home in July of 2008. And then we went through that sickness with 4 small children. And I was his primary caregiver. I was almost exclusively his only caregiver. We did have some people come in here and there throughout the process, especially when it got really bad. And then in August of 2009 is when he passed away.
And I could imagine with the kind of especially his beliefs around healing. What when you first got the diagnosis, how did you react? How did he react? What was your thought process?
We were on the same page in believing that God could heal because we both believe that the miracles that happen in the Bible are still miracles that can happen to this day. I'm not, I was, I've always been more on the emotional health side of healing supernaturally. And he was always on more the physical side, which actually made us a really good pair because when we would minister to people, I would minister more to their hearts and he'd minister more to their physical bodies. So when he was diagnosed, we both believed he could be healed. Um, I'm also a strong realist in a lot of ways, where I didn't want to just blindly be like, well, God heals, so Jeff's going to be healed. So when we first got the diagnosis, I actually spent some time with God, and I just said, all right, God, like, what do I need to know? Or what's going to get me through this no matter what happens? And the 2 things he said to me at that time that carried me through and even sometimes carried me through today, 12 years later, is 2 things. He said, you're never going to have to worry about money and you'll always be okay. And so even when it was like the worst times, because it wasn't just when he died that was the worst, it was actually the caregiving and the debilitation that would happen that was as painful as the death. And so when we were going through those times, when you're like, you have faith, you're believing that God could do something. We prayed. So we clocked a lot of hours of prayer. And so you're in that place of praying and you kind of get in the back of your mind, even when you have faith, your heart's hurting. And so you're thinking, am I going to be okay? Are we going to be okay? Especially raising 4 kids too. You're like, are we all going to be okay? And so that word that he gave to me in the very beginning was really beneficial because it allowed me to know that even in the darkest moments, like I was going to be okay. Even if I wasn't okay in that moment, I was going to be okay.
Yeah, that's really profound. When I was thinking I've heard you describe this one other time when you first when you first experienced it, probably a lot of people would have thought some of the things he was doing would have been like denial.
Mm-hmm.
And how
They
did
did.
because you had differences, obviously, in approach
Mm-hmm.
where you talk about being a realist, which a lot of people would say is a lack of faith, and you'd be shamed for
Mm-hmm.
being a realist.
Yeah, definitely.
And
And I
um,
was.
yeah, yeah. So you had all that going on too, and just kind of describe some of the dynamics and how that impacted your process.
Yeah. So, in a lot of ways, I'll kind of talk about the benefits because there's like pros and cons to it. There's pros and cons. There's pros to having faith, and there's cons to having faith. People think it's all just, great if you believe. But again, if we connect our hearts to the process, there's some things that do happen, like you said, of suppressing things or being too much of a realist where you're not able to actually connect to your heart to believe like a child. And so when we were going through it, the positives of Jeff having such a strong faith of being healed. His faith in being healed was so strong. He wrote a book about the promises of God while he was sick for that year, and he finished it 3 days before he died. And he would get up every single day saying, "Today I'm going to be healed. Today I'm going to be healed." And like when people have that in theory, that's great because, you have an idea that, yeah, I want to believe no matter what. But when you actually do it, when your whole entire body no longer works, when you're having to be moved by like a Hoyer lift because you can no longer move, but you get up every single day to be healed, that means that there's hope there. That means that you haven't given into depression. You haven't given into hopelessness. You believe. And so the benefit of that, even though we know the end of the story that he wasn't healed, the benefit was that he was always having a hopeful mindset. So that was amazing because he was able to be with the kids. He was able to be with myself and not let the sickness take away his hope. The negative side of it is he didn't want to talk about dying at all. We had one day that he was willing to, ask those hard questions and be able to say, I could ask him, what do you want for the kids? And we could go through, just all those questions you have to ask when someone's about to die. But it was one day. And then after that, nothing. So if I would like approach him and say on a different time and say, hey, if you don't make it, like, what should we do about this? And he'd be like, I don't want to talk about it at all. So that was the hard part as far as my heart having to prepare, especially at the very end where you knew if he didn't get a miracle, and he knew if he didn't get a miracle, he was going to die, but we couldn't talk about a lot of those things. So it was a mixture. There was some benefits of having such extreme faith, but then there was also some hard things about, and he also, knowing what I know now about emotions, he didn't talk about his emotions very much because he was so focused on his spirit and faith and healing that he didn't talk about being sad. He didn't talk about being scared. He did a little bit, but overall, every day it was just forward motion. And so that was also difficult for myself because I would feel emotions and then he couldn't be with me in them because he was so fighting to be healed so strongly. And I admire it so much, but it was also painful as well.
I can imagine it would make you feel kind of lonely.
There's definitely some moments that were lonely. It wasn't that I didn't want the same thing for him. And I was like coming alongside of him and being like, yes, I believe. Like he would, at the end, people would come in and say, you just need to accept you're going to die. And he would say, he couldn't talk very well because he couldn't breathe very well. He'd whisper to me, make them leave the house now. And so I'd be like, you need to leave the house now. Even though I'm more of like a people pleaser and I want people to be happy, I'd be like, okay, you need to leave the house now, because he was so fighting for healing, but he was, almost dying, that he couldn't afford to have unbelief or people not believing around him. So, I believed 100%. But like you're saying, even if you have faith and even if you believe, it's sad. It's scary. You feel alone. And so there was definitely some loneliness with it. Thankfully, he was kind and, like he said, like he felt for me. So it wasn't like I was completely alone, but I was alone in processing the potential future of what was going to happen.
That is such a balancing act, because I too believe in healing, but I would definitely err on the other side of not having, I would be way more in your camp and probably even further than where Jeff was. Where do you think that profound faith came from? How did he? Obviously he saw, so he experienced it. But even before that, where did this originate from? What was kind of his background?
His mom actually died of Lou Gehrig's disease as well. And you would have thought when we got married, it would be like, duh, this could happen. But when we studied it, there's two different types. There's a familiar one and a non-familiar one. And the familiar one is if it runs in your family, if, it's passed down. But if not, it's like really rare for anyone to get it. So when she had it, I didn't know that it ran in the family. I just thought it was just a fluke thing. So then I was like, oh, it's like 1 in a million. It's not going to happen. So we didn't actually think that was going to happen, even though obviously if we would have known more information, we would have known. But all that to say, um, so his mom died at a young age. He didn't have a mom, and he had a stepmom that came in that wasn't a healthy person, wasn't kind. And so he was, and then his dad worked all the time. He was a really good dad, but he worked all the time. And so he was raised very orphan like. And so when he came to know God when he was 19 years old, he went all in, and he would pray for hours. He would write out scripture, journal after journal. He was just really in love with God. And so, and that's before he even knew that healing was a possibility. That was just his relationship with God. And so really his profound faith came from his love relationship with God, and then just expanded as we came to Bethel and as we were learning more and more about, healing and, just the different ways of connecting to God.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I know it's not easy.
Yeah, they're still sad, when you go back to it and
Mm-hmm.
you're there, because, your memories are still alive. When I tell you the story, I'm living it.
Right. Absolutely. Well, something that you said recently that I wrote down, you said that there is something precious about loss that you don't want to rush into helping others. You want to spend time with it yourself. So if you could just expound on that a little bit.
Yeah. So ironically, really in just the last couple of years, so Jeff's been gone for 12 years, and it's only been the last couple of years that I've actually been starting to share the lessons I've learned in grief. And because I have sat with it for 10 years before I started to share it. And even though the compassion method was birthed from it, I've kind of held my story closer to me. I don't usually bring up my story of loss into it. In fact, a lot of people don't even know that part of my story, because I haven't been saying, all right, here's like my stamp of authority to be able to walk you through pain and suffering, because I've been through it. If it if it's an appropriate time to share, I do share it. It's not like I'm trying to hide it, but I'm not saying, okay, I want to be able just to go and now I have authority to give it, so I'm going to go help people. There's something about me sitting in my grief, getting comfort, being able to get to know myself in it, to be there with myself in it, and invite God and others to come be with me in it. That's more precious than going out and kind of almost selling it to a certain degree, or even helping others. Even though that sounds noble to help other people, I have to be able to walk through my grief process and really feel it and experience it in order to be able to give it to other people. It's like I've seen a lot of times in a different context, like people will have like an affair. And then like 2 weeks later, they're out teaching people how not to have affairs. And I look at it and it's not a judgment, but it's like, how could you go through the pain of having an affair and then turn around so quickly and try to go help other people when there's no possible way in 2 weeks or 2 months, and I would even go as far as say in 2 years, that you would be able to process that pain to such a degree that you've not just had the experience, but you felt the pain, you've gotten comfort, and you've been able to actually let go or go play in that. And that was always my goal, that I would be able to really feel my pain, because it is very precious, before I made it public, before I used it. I don't want to use my experience, because that's using myself. And I don't want to do that. I want my experience to be my experience and not be used.
Yeah. Well, and something else you say oftentimes is take all the time that you need. And I think it's powerful that, you just kind of shared 10 years essentially before you started kind of going there. And I think a lot of people probably put a timeline on their grieving process. Oh, like,
Exactly.
okay, I should be done now.
Yeah, I did that too. I was like, check, are we done? Because you want it again, like you said a little while ago, we're so adverse to pain, we want it to be over. You know, I remember asking God in the very beginning, how long is this going to take? And he's like, just take it day by day. Because if he would have told me, I would have been like, oh my goodness. And I waited 10 years because that's my story. I don't think there's a set time for people. If anyone listening has experienced grief and it's been a couple years and you're starting to share your story, that's great. But I think it's really important to care for yourself first and then care for others. And we're so quick to try to go give it to other people before we've properly been able to care for ourselves.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think in a way, part of that is our medicating process.
Hmm.
Probably, that's kind of
Yeah.
our reaction to that.
And also that feeling, because you're suffering loss, you want to make the loss count. You want to make it do something. You're like, okay. And I remember feeling this in the beginning too. We want to be able to make his death mean something. But his death doesn't need to mean something. He means something. I mean something. And yes, through his death, people have been healed and people have benefited. But more importantly than people benefiting from his death, is people benefiting from knowing him. And that is why I'm glad he wrote the book the last year, because it really shows who he is. And that's more valuable than his death.
Absolutely. I think you make a really good point, because I think a lot of people look for some sort of significance, like like something significant has to happen from the loss of their loved one so that they can receive healing. But yeah, that is a really great point that you bring up, that doesn't have to happen, because sometimes when people die, it was a bad accident, and sometimes it was even their fault, or and I would imagine that if you're trying to find purpose, like this profound
Hmm.
purpose, it could really delay.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, you bring up a really good point. There's a lot of shame sometimes with loss, like you said, if it's their fault, if it's a drug overdose, if it's something that feels like it was in their control to do, and then they die. A lot of people believe through shame that that person's death is no longer, that person's not even just their death, but their life no longer has significance because of how they left this world. But what they did or what they didn't do is not who they are. And so if you're listening to this and you had a death that happened in a shameful way, or a way that you feel like lessen the value and the worth of that person, I want to encourage you that that person is just as valuable regardless of how they left this earth. It's because of who they are.
Well, and I think as sometimes our faith and our beliefs can kind of really get in the way of those, and I'm thinking specifically in like the area of like suicide. So a lot of people look at that as a shameful thing, but suicide, as you've shared with me, is just a triggered response to pain, and it was just a hurting person, and it doesn't. Uh, and God sees through all of that, and we have so many bad belief systems around some of these things that can really get in the way of that grieving process, and really prevent us from going there, because we think, well, I can't go there because there was shame connected to that circumstance.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. That is one of the most shameful ways someone, dies. And there's a lot of times they don't get the honor of being, honored for who they are because of it. And I completely agree that it's just a reaction to pain, and a devastating reaction to pain, but it's still coming from pain, not because this person was a bad person, but they chose that action.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think one of the things um, that we do, I think, is we're very quick to rush to judgment, and we don't recognize that if we really step back, we've all done shameful things, we've all done dumb things, and that bad accident or whatever, we could have been behind the wheel, we could have been that person too. So yeah. So we've talked about triggers in previous episode, and we defined a trigger as an irrational response to a rational or irrational person, situation, or circumstance. And what I'm going to say is, it sounds kind of crazy, but a death, in your case, the loss of a loved one, can be a triggering experience. And you think, well, of course it's going to trigger you. It's
Yeah.
perfectly rational. And it is.
Yep.
It
Try
is.
telling that to someone right after they've experienced a
Yeah.
death, and that would not go over well. But what you're
Yeah.
about to say is definitely true.
Yeah. So why don't you describe a little bit of your triggered reaction after Jeff's passing, or even at any point leading up to
Yeah.
it or after? Because the grieving
Yeah.
process started the day you got the diagnosis.
Exactly. It definitely did. I did a lot of pre grieving because of it. And then, of course, post grieving as well. And grief kind of sneaks up on you at different times. So it's not always a certain time frame. So well said in that. Yeah. So how I got triggered when Jeff died, or even when he was sick too, because it started happening then as well, is I started feeling abandoned. I started feeling that, he was leaving me. And here I have him saying, I'm going to get healed today. I'm never going to leave because I'm going to get healed. So all of his actions, and if I'm thinking of it rationally, were saying, I'm fighting for you. I'm fighting for the kids. I believe I'm going to be healed. Everything says I'm not abandoning you. But because when I was a little girl, my dad left me, I am filtering it through that pain. So it's no longer a rational thing that he's not purposely trying to get sick and die, but I'm feeling abandoned. I'm feeling triggered by that. And how I kind of communicate that to people is that's a compounded grief. So I'm having the grief of him, going through the process of his sickness, as well as eventually his death. But it's being compounded because my dad left. It's being compounded because when I was 3, my mom wasn't able to get out of bed because she had to be on bed rest because one of my sisters had previa, which means that if she got out of bed, she would die or the baby would die or both. And so she was in bed for 5 months when I was 3 years old. So I felt abandoned. She could no longer hold me. I couldn't get on the bed because even if we shook the bed, she could bleed. And so I couldn't be held anymore at 3 years old. So I felt abandoned. And then my dad left, and so I felt abandoned. And then now here's Jeff sick and dying, and I feel abandoned. But that was a trigger and a compounded grief because I was actually grieving my past simultaneously as grieving my present.
That's a really good thing that you bring up, because when people are going through the process, obviously the easiest thing to look at is what's right in front of you. And what you're saying is that the grieving process is so much worse because there's things along the way that we haven't taken care of. It's kind of what I talked about at the beginning. We have this pain, we don't know what to do with it, so we hide it, but it can't stay hidden forever. It's eventually going to come back. And
No, yeah. And that's kind of when I say, a lot of times I'll say grief is a gift. And again, tell me that when I'm going in the pit of grief, I'm going to be pretty upset at that statement. But it's true. Grief is a gift because it exposes the pain. The present grief we're experiencing exposes our past grief so we can take care of what never got taken care of.
yeah, so in many ways, it's an opportunity.
It really is an opportunity, something you would never wish on yourself or anyone else, but it's something that we cannot get to the depths of our pain until we feel the depths of our pain. And feeling the depths of our pain comes through experiencing a loss.
Mm-hmm. You've shared before how there can be beauty.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
There's a lot of beauty in it too, because you start to recognize that everything we hold on to so tightly, most people, even sometimes when people hear the story, it might be somebody listening right now, they're like, I could never do that. If my spouse died, I don't even know how she did it. Sometimes people think I'm like a hero because I went through all this, and I am proud of myself and how I went through it. But people will say, I could never go through that because we fear pain so profoundly. But there's something about going through it that you realize that you're okay, even if your worst fear comes true. You can be okay even going through the thing you thought you never could go through. And it's a really beautiful thing to realize that we are not, our internal world, our well-being is not contingent on having a spouse. It's not contingent on losing a spouse. It's not contingent on those things. And that's something that I've been able to firsthand experience and I live out daily. That's a really beautiful thing.
Absolutely. So what do you think, obviously when you were going through this, you didn't know a lot of what you know today.
No, I didn't know any of this.
So what do you think, looking back, where do you think you did well through the grieving process? And what are some areas where you think you could have maybe been a little kinder to yourself?
Yeah, no, that's good. So I would say that definitely I went through some denial because I didn't know how to deal with emotions. My children actually were really helpful in my grieving process because children don't hide things. They don't They don't grieve when it's the appropriate time to grieve. They don't agree when it's convenient. When they feel, they feel. And one of the things that I did well with them that ended up being well for me is that I knew I couldn't fix it. I knew I couldn't change it. And when we love our kids so much, or anyone in our lives, if we can't fix it and we can't change it, we instinctively move away from the situation because it's too painful to be with someone in their pain. So now I know through the compassion method how valuable it is to be with someone in their pain. At that time, I didn't know the value of it, but I knew that that's what I needed to do. And so I would sit with them in their pain, and I would let them cry, and I would let them be angry, and I would let them be scared, and I would let them feel their loss of their daddy dying. And I would weep with them. Indirectly, I would grieve my loss because they were grieving their loss, and I was with them in it. And so that's something that's really amazing about being with people in their grief, is that it allows you to grieve as you are with them in their grief. So it's not just me being this great mom that's with my kids in their pain. Their ability to feel their pain allowed me to feel my pain. And so we would all cry together. And that was one of the most healing processes in the grief, to be able to just allow that to happen and not try to control it and not try to fix it, but just let it flow.
Mm-hmm. That's a really neat thing how you said how the kids don't know the right or wrong time to grieve, which is funny because there isn't a right or wrong time to grieve.
No, that's actually the most powerful way to grieve, is to grieve, to be able to make space to grieve whenever you need to grieve, even if it's not appropriate. Saying you are grieving appropriately does not matter more than you allowing space to grieve. And sometimes that was hard because, you know, how when you grieve, it's not pretty. It's not like they just are like, just crying, you know, they're angry, you know, they're throwing fits. They're feeling out of control. They're feeling all those feelings that we feel. They're confused. They're in deep pain. So it's not pretty. So it would be very easy to control them. And I'm not saying I didn't ever, you know, there was times where I'm like, I don't know what to do here. Okay, well, we can't do this here. We've got to, like, let's go to the car. Let's do stuff. So, I mean, I wasn't perfect in it, of course, because sometimes it's very messy. But for the most part, I tried to let them feel it wherever they were at, which helped me feel it wherever I was at.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you talked about as well that you maybe, I heard you say before, that you maybe thought you could have done differently, is that you medicated a little bit.
And
you
forgot about that. I suppressed that too.
Don't want to bring any of this up, but
no, I like it.
Just talk a little bit about the ways that you medicated, because obviously, you know, like you said, you didn't know what you know now, but
yeah,
this is how we learn. So
just call me out, Brian. Call me out. Just sharing my heart here, and Brian's calling me out. No, just teasing. No, it's a very good.
No, actually, I look at it as we're helping people learn.
Oh yeah, I forgot.
That's what we're helping people learn, and they can learn. Yeah. We can learn from our mistakes oftentimes much more than we learn from what we did right. So,
I agree. So, yes, I definitely medicated, and to a certain degree, medicating is how we get through pain. We weren't created to feel pain. We were never meant to. But when Adam and Eve ate of the knowledge of good and evil, they experienced pain. And that pain is what we're experiencing now that we aren't equipped to experience. Of course, God has taught us how to walk through pain, but we're adverse to it because that wasn't the way it was meant to be. So that being said, we are going to medicate instinctively, or even like in survival. So I actually honestly believe that some medication is good. Some denial is good, because we can't take I couldn't grieve the whole process all at once. It'd be way too much. So denial or medication allows you to grieve incrementally. Sometimes, you know, you're still grieving intensely, but we couldn't grieve every single day to that level, or it would kill us. So some medication I feel like is definitely okay. But when we habitually start to medicate and we don't take care of our pain, that's where that suppression is going to cause us to get stuck in our grief and stuck in our pain. One of the ways that I medicated was through thankfulness. And I got a lot of like pats on the back for how I medicated. So I didn't medicate messy. I medicated like, I was like so thankful. And people would be like, wow, her husband died and she's so thankful. And I would be like, I like that because that was how I felt loved. And so I was like, oh, great. And I'm going to be even more thankful because I'm feeling even more loved. And so I would have times where I would just sit and try to thank God every day for 20 things. And so I would just be thanking him for everything I could think of. And on a neurological level, thankfulness releases endorphins, serotonin, feel good feelings. And so it would make me feel better to be thankful. But I wasn't taking care of my pain. I was just covering it up with thankfulness. And it would literally feel like this. I'd have a wave of grief come over that felt debilitating. I would feel it physically. I would have mental thoughts that I was thinking, and I'd have emotions that would come up that would feel like, have you ever been like punched in the stomach? That's how it would feel because it was so painful. And so it would like take my breath away and I would be like scrambling out of the feeling because it felt so painful. You almost feel like you're going to die because emotional pain feels that strong. So that wave comes over me. I'm frantically trying to get out of it. So I start saying, thank you, God, for my kids. Thank you, God, that we're okay. Thank you that we don't have to worry about money. Thank you that I'm okay. Thank you, God. Da, 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 da. And I'm actually hooking up an IV of thankfulness in that moment to help cover up that extreme wave that just hit me. And as I'm doing it, my serotonin levels are going up. I'm starting to feel better. And then after I had said my 20 things I was thankful for, I would have this relief where I'd be like, okay, we're okay now. And I could continue on in life. But the thing about that is, I never felt my sad. I never felt my scared. I didn't feel my loneliness. I didn't feel my pain because the trigger of it was so strong. I just tried to get the trigger to stop through thankfulness. And another thing that I medicated for that I got a lot of points for as well was God. So here my husband died. We believed he was going to be healed and he wasn't. And I would tell everybody, I'm not mad at God. It's all going to be okay. And I was completely connected to God, which I was like, I'm doing really good. Because all those messy people, they get mad at God. And all those messy people, they have a hard time. They're offended by God. And they don't get out of bed in the morning. And they don't do well. But I'm okay with God. And so I would worship and I would pray and I would again neurologically release those serotonins of prayer and worship and, being able to feel good with God. But again, just like thankfulness, I never felt my pain. I just covered it up with God with thankfulness, which was a form of denial or medication.
One thing, speaking of your relationship with God, one thing that you have shared is that, as far as how, well, I guess just share a little bit how it did impact your relationship with him. You shared, kind of how you used him for medication a little bit, and he's okay with that. He knows.
He knows.
and the thing about medication, and when I was sharing that earlier in jest, we're all doing the best we can with what we know.
Exactly.
And like you said, at that time, your thankfulness or your positivity that you were having was you doing the best you could.
Exactly.
At that time to take care of yourself.
Exactly. Because so along the same lines as thankfulness in God, there's a popular trend right now, toxic positivity, where you're just trying to be positive to cover up pain. And there's a lot of shame connected to it. Where I got more points for God and thankfulness, toxic positivity, that doesn't sound very good. And there's a lot of shame that people receive when they say, even though I'm experiencing pain, I'm trying to be positive right now. And I'm trying to look at, the best side of it. Or even if I'm in complete denial, just trying to be positive, there's a lot of shame that says you're toxic. But like you just said, we're doing the best we can. I was doing the best I could. I didn't know what I know now. When that wave of pain came with no knowledge of what it was, I didn't know it was a trigger. I thought it was real. I thought it was going to kill me. And so I'm scrambling for anything I can do to to be able to, I'm drowning. So I'm grabbing anything I can do that's going to help me float. So if you've chosen any type of medication, whether it be, positivity or God or thankfulness, or even what we think as negative medications, even if it was drugs or food or anything to be able to medicate that pain. I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud that you were so brave to find something to be able to help yourself in such a severe place of pain. So there's no shame in whatever you grabbed a hold of. There's no shame in it. You did the best you could.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that'll speak to a lot of people right there.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yeah.
we've talked some about the knowledge of good and evil. So we tend to operate in that system where we think there's always a right way and a wrong way to do things.
Oh,
And
yeah, I know, especially in grief.
yeah,
People are so adverse to it. Like we said, everyone's trying to find out the secret formula of grief. And there's no secret formula. There's not a right or wrong way, because even the things that we perceive as wrong that we do in grief can sometimes be the thing that actually helps us get the most comfort, and it helps us work through grief in ways that we couldn't if we didn't choose the wrong thing.
mm-hmm. Yeah. I think one of the most profound things I ever heard from a person who was grieving, as they were like right in the beginning of their process, they had just lost their daughter in a horrible accident. And the gentleman said that he said, we're just taking this one breath at a time. And when I went through my own experience with emotional pain, I remember remembering back to that. And I was just thinking, I just had to make my world really small and just start off, 1 hour at a time. Okay, I'm just going to focus on the next hour. And then I got to a point where I could think a day in advance. But then if I started to think too far in advance, it would just come, that pain like you were describing would just come at me, and I would just have to get my world really small again. And that was how I took care of myself. And it was really helpful. And I'm very thankful, having read the article, of that man sharing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great advice.
So, we were talking about the whole right or wrong way to grieve. So how did you, and how there isn't, but yet people think there is. So how did you process people's attempts to help you through this grieving process?
Well, I was going to write a book about it in the beginning because it's so funny and I have compassion for people too. And I've been that person too. I've been that person even after experiencing loss. You'd think I'd be a professional on what to say. And I've put my foot in my mouth too. So yeah, when someone dies, it's so hard to know what to say. You're dealing with this huge pain that we're trying to somehow help the person feel comforted in. And so we think sometimes to ourselves, what would I want to hear? So then we tell that person what we'd want to hear. And sometimes that works because that's what that person needs to hear. And sometimes it really doesn't work because that person is not you and they didn't benefit from what you thought they would want to hear. But one of the things that I did was, one, I am an empathetic person, even before I knew about our neurological process with emotions and how emotions affect us, and ultimately the whole compassion method. I've always been pretty empathetic. And so what I would do is I would recognize they don't know what they're saying, even though sometimes I did want to kind of pull them aside and be like, you really shouldn't say this. I'm okay right now, but the next person is probably not going to be okay. One of the things that stood out to me so much, just on a kind of a funny note, is, it was sad at the time, but it's funny now. I was at the funeral and people are coming up and saying, so sorry for your loss and everything. And this guy comes up, and he had recently been divorced, and he had, 3 kids, I think. And he comes up and he's in like the throes of being a single dad. And so he's processing through his own pain, what I'm about to go through. And he comes up to me and he says, being a single mom is really hard, but it's okay. Like, you're going to be all right. And I didn't even realize I was a single mom. I remember being like, what? I'm a single mom? Like, I hadn't even processed the ramifications of him dying. And now I was a single mom. And like how you said, you take it one breath at a time, one thing at a time. It was kind of a little bit of a sucker punch in a way, because you were like processing something that today I didn't need to process. Today I wasn't dealing with what that was going to be like. And so anyways, it was just funny because I had no idea. So
ignorance is bliss. And in that moment, it would have been better to just be a little ignorant of that.
Yeah. But I will say, along the lines of single parent, I have really been blessed with people coming alongside me and my kids through this whole 12 years that Jeff's been gone. I had so many amazing men, a lot of them being my brothers and cousins and their roommates, come alongside our family and be there for us. So much so that I would have married friends be jealous of how much love my kids got because they had so many love sources, so many people that loved them through this process. And then again, so much so that I've never really felt like a single mom. I remember one time like telling somebody, I'm really like I'm so sad that you're going through this. It must be so hard to be a single mom. I just feel so bad for you. And she like looks at me funny and she's like, she only had one child as well. And she was like, you're a single mom of 4 kids. She's like, like it must be hard for you too. And I was like, oh, yeah. I was like, yeah, I guess I'm a single mom, but I never associate it as it doesn't mean I didn't have hard moments as a single mom. And even with love coming alongside you, it's still difficult. I just never identified as it being my identity because I had so much love come into my life and for my kids, I never felt the pain of that. And so if you are a single parent and you're listening to this, when love comes into your life and your kid's life, it doesn't mean that there's no hardship and there's no pain and suffering of being a single mom, but it relieves a lot of that pressure to have love in your life as you're raising your kids on your own.
It's really core to what we talk about in the compassion method is that when we're going through our early childhood development, we're looking for that love to come from our biological parents. And when it doesn't, God provides in other ways. We just don't always have eyes to see. And I would suspect that for a lot of people going through the grieving process, they're unknowingly, subconsciously blocking a lot of times some of that from coming in because maybe they feel guilty or they
or they still want it to come from their spouse who's passed away. I know that sounds weird and irrational, but it's like you want it to come. Like I could have done that. I could have been like, their dad's gone. There's not, he's not here to be with them. I'm going to shut out these love sources that came in to father my kids.
Well, speaking of your kids, what are some other things this is great how the different people came in and you allowed that to happen. What are some other things that you did with your kids to kind of help them through the process?
Yeah, one of my favorite things was that, and a lot of the things I did, I did them. And then in hindsight, I'm like, whoa, that was really good. And it works both ways. Some of the things I did, I'm like, that did not work. And in hindsight, you're like, what was I thinking? So again, going back to shame of doing it right or wrong, we're doing the best we can. Some things you're going to look back and say, wow, I did such a great job in this. And other things you're going to look back and be like, I did the best I could, but I definitely didn't do well in that area. But one of the areas that I was really, was actually like a fun one to me was, so after Jeff died, we had some family friends that owned property and a cabin. And we started going out there probably every couple months. And they had like ATV vehicles and quads and rope swings and, rocks to jump off of and hiking and just a lot of adventure. And so what me and the kids started doing is I did it with them. We would jump off rocks together. We would go on ATV vehicle rides together. We would, just do these risk-taking activities. And what I realized is so we're going through trauma with losing a dad and losing a husband. And that trauma is creating what they call a trauma bond. So we're bonding over trauma. Well, when you experience these risk-taking things, they mimic trauma because they're scary. When you're on the top of the rock with your child and they're like, I can't jump, I'm too scared. And they're paralyzed with fear from jumping off the rock. It's similar to the paralyzing fear of losing their daddy. But now we're bringing in the positive experience of being together in jumping off the rock together. And then the thrill of jumping off and overcoming something. And then the connection that we had having these experiences together was really healing in the process. And so much so that I shared that same idea with a friend of mine that runs an anti-trafficking organization. And they ended up coming up with this whole process that's happening right now to this day, where they do risk-taking things with the girls that have experienced trauma bonds with what they've experienced in trafficking. And then they reestablish healthy trauma bonds through these risk-taking activities. So not only did my kids benefit from us doing these risk-taking activities that created a sense of comfort, being with, overcoming, being able to actually kind of walk through the grief process in this very practical, tangible way. We're also able to share that with other people that had gone through pain and suffering as well.
Yeah, that's really neat. And I'm sure as you were going through that, some people again would probably say, well, you're just being in denial or you're doing whatever. But at the same time, there's a lot of other things going on, and that's really, really
Mm-hmm.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was amazing. Well, I mean, and really, like, we're reenacting the grief process. So, I mean, the kids were terrified to jump off the rock, or they were terrified to ride the motorcycle when they'd never done it before. So, I mean, we were actually feeling the scared and the pain and those big emotions, and then being able to bring comfort to them in a live way.
Yeah. So we shared a little bit earlier how there is beauty that can be found in grief, and sharing about your kids and some of those experiences. Those are some beautiful things. And what are some other like practical ways that you think that you could share to help a person move from a place of their grief maybe being in a very debilitating place to helping them find the beauty in it?
Yeah, so that kind of brings us to what was birthed through my grief process was the compassion method. And if you've been listening to this podcast, you've already heard several of the components of it. But I kind of want to take those same components we've been learning about and share it from the kind of the perspective of grief. So first of all, this you have to face the scariest part of it is being able to feel your emotions. That wave I talked about earlier when I was saying that I wanted to cover it up and I wanted to medicate it with thankfulness because it was so debilitating. And like I said, you feel it physically. It feels like you're going to die, even though it's an emotional pain. That's how intense it can feel. And so, first of all, well, even a step before that, being able to stop blaming your loss and start taking care of how that loss specifically made you feel. You mentioned that triggers can come from something that's actually rational and justified. So I had every reason to not take care of my internal world because I had such a good reason to stay stuck in my pain because my husband died. And if my husband died, I shouldn't have to take care of my inner world because that's such a hard loss that should actually be focus, him dying. But I had to do a really brave thing and say, this isn't completely about Jeff dying. There's more to this story. And if I continue to blame his death for my pain, I'm never going to take care of my pain. And I don't think that that's something that we can do right away because our knee-jerk reaction when we experience pain is to blame. And that's okay. If you're in the beginning of a grief process and you're like, I can't do that. It is his death. It is her death. It is that. And I've got to focus on that for a little while. That's okay. Focus on it as long as you need to. But when you're ready, let's go ahead and pause that loss. That's a very courageous thing to do. And then let's come and put our heart, our affection, our attention on how that pain is making us feel. Because everyone feels pain differently. You know, even once you've had like a spouse die, then you end up somehow running into other people that they've had spouses die, and you think, oh, good, like I'm finally gonna like have somebody that knows exactly what I'm feeling. So you start to share your stories, and in some ways there's some parallels, and so you feel comfort of being understood and comfort of having gone through the same thing, but you quickly find that their story is not the same as your story. Their compounded grief that they've experienced before they lost their spouse is different. Who they are as a person and how their flavor of how they experience pain is different. And so all of a sudden you can actually kind of feel lonely in what you thought was going to be this very strong connecting point because we all experience pain differently.
Yeah. And you shared about the compounded grief. You shared a little bit that when you were finally able to do that, and at what point do you think you were able to pause and kind of recognize that there was more underneath there was more to this
Mm-hmm.
story than?
Yeah. It's how it kind of worked for me, and I'm imagining it might work for other people similarly, is I would kind of get like these little like nudges, like, this feeling inside of me doesn't really match this. And I could blame it and make it match it. But I kind of knew myself enough to know I'm having a really big response right now, or I'm feeling really abandoned, or I'm feeling really alone. And this loneliness feels bigger or different than this grief of losing Jeff. And so I'd start kind of almost getting like these nudges that were saying, like, hey, I think there's more to this story. And then, but because the pain was so big and I didn't know what it was and I didn't know what to do with it, I'd kind of like press those things down. And then they would kind of come back up. Hey, there's more to this story. And then I would press it back down. So I'd say 6 months to a year after I started to become curious, because the pain, time doesn't heal all wounds, but sometimes time can help relieve some of the pressure to be able to see it a little differently. So I'd say about 6 months to a year I started, but it wasn't just this like all of a sudden thing. It was kind of just like a gradual process of recognizing there's more to this story.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, I didn't know any of this either. So this is
right.
all like instinct and God leading me through this process.
Yeah. And learning as you go.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the things that you uncovered, you recognized there was a bunch of pain that you hadn't grieved from childhood that
Yes.
was really,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. And share
And
a little bit
yeah.
about that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that was kind of shocking because here I was like grieving Jeff. And then all of a sudden, so my dad left when I was 12, I believe. And all of a sudden, I felt like I was like 12 years old in it. And then I could feel like, I don't think this is really about Jeff right now. I think this is about my dad. And I could feel the similarities. And so my brain was reconnecting with that time. And so I would be like, oh, this is about that. So that's 13 or 12. And then I remember kind of like going back to being 12 and then being like, this doesn't feel like 12. This feels like 3, because I felt so little in those moments of grief. I felt like I was completely abandoned. I felt like I was never going to get what I needed. And it felt so irrational because, like I told you, I had I have a big family. I have a lot of people that love me. I was surrounded by love. So logically, I shouldn't feel as lonely as I'm feeling. Not shouldn't, but it doesn't really match. Not maybe in the very beginning when the pain was so big, but as time went on, I'm like, why am I feeling so alone when I have 20 people around me? And I was recognizing that loneliness and that pain was really 3 years old. And so then I was like, I remember, just up here what had happened at that time, but that's when I started to really feel what that 3-year-old was feeling. And it matched what I was feeling with Jeff. So I knew it originated there because our early childhood development is our coding for the rest of your life, rest of my life. And so how I processed my pain at 3 years old with my mom not being able to hold me and feeling that loneliness and abandonment was exactly how I processed Jeff dying.
And I could imagine a lot of people, it would be hard for them to do this pause because they would feel like they're dishonoring the memory of, or dishonoring, or, whatever happened. But it's very important to do that because one thing that you shared about is that we want to be able to, by going through this process, you can begin to miss who the person was, not what they did for you.
Yeah.
So you can actually,
yes.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if you wanted to share a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So after Jeff died, I was actually kind of scared when I would see pictures of him, or like when I would, like someone would bring up something, it actually started feeling kind of scary because there was so much pain connected to him, especially in the caregiving part, because that was so traumatic, as well as him dying. That was traumatic, that I actually put his picture on my phone for a couple weeks because I was forgetting who he was, and I was seeing him as my pain. And so it was distorting my how I saw him. So then I would just see him on my phone. And at first I would have like a versal, I'd have a reaction to it. Like I would be like, oh, like I could feel it physically. But as I kept looking at his picture, I was actually able to reconnect with who he was before he was sick, and even who he was when he was sick, and then who he was separate from his death. And that was really healing because now I started to honor who he was. Like I had mentioned previously, I started honoring who he was, not honoring his death. We think honoring someone's death and like deeply grieving them is honoring them, and it can be, but sometimes we lose sight of the person because we're so immersed in our pain that we end up being connected to the pain, not to the person.
Hmm. And the degree that we can comfort that pain is directly connected to the degree that we can allow compassion to come in. So just kind of maybe speak to that. How can we do that?
Yeah. So if you're worried, kind of like you were saying, of like me focusing on my compounded grief could take away from grieving the present situation. When I take care of it through comfort and compassion, like you mentioned, when compassion comes in for that 3-year-old, and that compassion comes in for that 12-year-old, and compassion comes in for my, I think it was 29-year-old when that happened. When that compassion comes in, I'm able to actually get full. I'm able to get my needs met. I'm able to receive comfort, and that compassion heals. So now, just feeling your pain will not heal you. A lot of people think that in the grief process. They think grieving is feeling your pain so you can get better. It's not. Grieving is feeling your pain, getting comfort, letting go, or being able to go play again.
Hmm. And how can we receive comfort?
So, comfort came from going back to my coding and bringing comfort to that 3-year-old. Because my ability to receive, as in my present situation when he died, was limited because my coding was abandoned, lonely, nobody was meeting her needs. And so if I'm going to receive proper comfort, it's not going to come as an adult with well-meaning people, family and friends hugging me and holding me. That's going to help my adult self. That's going to help me in the moment. But in order to be able to receive compassion and comfort on a deeper level, it has to come through going back to being able to infuse your early childhood development with comfort and compassion, which dominoes up to me as an adult, being able to receive comfort and compassion from my surroundings. A lot of people as adults, when you experience grief, people will say things like, yeah, people give me hugs and I just can't feel it. People bring me food and it just doesn't feel like anything. Because they didn't know how to receive it when they were younger in their trauma. They can't receive it now as an adult in their trauma.
So the thing we think it's all about, as we're learning, it's about so much more. And what kind of advice would you give to someone that just feels completely incapacitated in their process or just completely stuck? Because they might hear this and like, oh yeah, Laura, that sounds great, but what do I do now?
Yeah, patience. Be really patient with yourself. We want to rush out of pain. Come back to being patient with yourself. Start with putting your hand on your heart very simply and just saying, take all the time you need. Part of you will feel soothed by that. The other part will feel even more frantic from saying that. Say it again. Take all the time you need. We end up leaving ourselves in grief because it's too painful. So we want to be able to say to our heart, I will stay with you. I'm not going to leave you. Again, part of you will feel soothed by that. The other part of you will say, I want to run as fast and as far from you as I can. Say it again. I'll stay with you. And being able to bring that compassion to your heart, even when your heart's saying, I don't believe you, being able to just start to introduce being compassionate and kind with yourself and your pain. And that would be enough for the moment. Continue to grieve. Continue to stay in that process, continue to do whatever you are doing to survive. And then maybe a couple of days later, the same exact thing. Take all the time you need. I'll stay with you. As you do that, as much as you're able to do it, your heart is going to start to become more tender. And then you'd want to go deeper into the process, like I was talking about, of being able to pause your grief, to be able to recognize what you're feeling, to start recognizing what you're needing. But like you said, when you're in a debilitated state, you're like a child in a way. Like you can barely do anything. And we want to be able to say, it's kind of like, how like physical therapy, after you've had like an accident, you go in and they have you just like barely move a muscle. And it feels like you just lifted 100 pounds because that muscle has been debilitated and it's not able to move the way it once was able to move. Well, that's kind of how our hearts are in grief and loss. We can't do what we used to be able to do. you'll feel like your capacity is so limited. And so all you can do is barely move your heart, barely bring comfort. And it'll feel like you just lifted 100 pounds in your heart. But just like physical therapy, a little bit starts to build and build until you'll be ready to walk through the compassion method, till you'll be ready to face your pain, till you'll be ready to feel your pain and get comfort and let go.
We've talked quite a bit about some of these things already, but what are some of the biggest barriers preventing a person from moving forward in their grieving process? And one of them that I want you to really hit on, that I want to make sure that we talk about, is comparison. Because we talked about at the beginning how, sharing the loss of Jeff is very deep and it's very profound, and it's obviously profound. But a lot of people are grieving things that aren't obvious, and they might only be obvious to their heart. To someone else, they'd look at it and be like, that's silly. That's no big deal. Get over it. And I think that comparison is a real killer for us in this process. So maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, comparison definitely is. If you don't honor your pain and listen to your heart and acknowledge it's as big as you feel it is, regardless of how big the loss was, then you'll never properly comfort your heart, because you've decided ahead of time that that pain is not worth comforting, because it's not big enough and it's not important enough. Because my husband died and you're grieving the loss of a pet. And so it feels like it's not that big of a deal, but it's a huge deal. Whenever I work with children a lot of times feel things bigger, which causes them to exaggerate or tell a story that may not have all the facts to it. So adults around them want to jump in with their adult brain and say, that's not how it was. But for that child, how they experienced it was real. One of the stories that had happened that relates to this is I had a friend, and she had left her son for 15 minutes. He was only like 7 or 8. And he had vividly imagined his mom died. That's why she was late. And so he was in distress. He was screaming and crying, and the people that were with him were trying to comfort him and saying, "Don't worry, your mom's coming." And then his mom gets there, and she's like, and he's like, "You were gone for an hour, and I thought you died." And he was crying, and then he proceeded to have dreams every night that his mom died, and he was stuck in it. And he comes to me with these dark circles underneath his eyes, and tells me, "I thought my mom died." And so I treated him as if his mom died, because that's what he experienced. He was grieving as if she had died because his imagination, especially as a child, saw it as it happened, and he felt it as it happened. And so he was grieving her dying and screaming and crying as if it was true. So we brought comfort to him, to the seriousness that he felt, even though as an adult, we look at it and say, "Your mom wasn't there for 15 minutes. It's not a big deal. Here she is. She didn't die. She's fine. Get over it." And so I share that example because if you're experiencing pain and a loss and it feels really big, it is really big. That's why it's so important not to measure it or compare it, because then you will not properly take care of it, because you've already decided it's not worth the compassion, nurture, and time to take care of it.
And I think the point we want to drive home is that your story is a big deal.
It is a big deal. And what you feel is a really big deal as well.
Mm-hmm. Doesn't have to have a perfect explanation. Leading with logic in these things is not always, how do you say that? Logic's obviously very important, but
very important,
but we don't want to lead with it.
No, exactly. We want to be able to have a whole brain thinking when we go through things, that we are connecting to our emotions in it and our logic in it, and recognizing that they're both valuable. I do want to share one thing just from you sharing that. A lot of times when we go through a lot of loss, we'll become very emotional. And for a period of time, everyone will be able to say, "You're okay. You can be emotional. You got a reason to be emotional." But what happens if it's been 2 years and you're still really emotional? People are going to start to tell you it's time to get over it. They're going to start to shame you. They're going to start to logic you that you no longer should be feeling those things, because logically you should be over it. But we want to be able to recognize that those emotions are telling you that there's pain, whether it's from the present pain or the compounded pain that you've experienced. And those big emotions are a gift that's trying to tell you we still have pain. And your logic will say, too bad, the time limit's over. You can't take care of it anymore. But we're going to honor those emotions, even if they don't logically seem appropriate. Because if we're having big emotions, that means we still have pain or unmet need.
Yeah. And thank you for bringing that up. That's another area where that knowledge of good and evil, and there's a right way and a wrong way to do it.
Yep.
Sneaks in there and
Yeah.
grabs us.
That clock's for ourselves personally, and then for people around us, we all have a clock on things because we're like, you only get a certain amount of time to grieve or a certain amount of time to go through it, and then you should be okay. And we're all different. For one person, they could grieve a certain duration of time, another person, a longer duration of time. We're all different based on who we were created to be, based on our compounded grief, and based on how we're experiencing that grief in our present day life.
Well, as we conclude today, I was just wondering if there was anything else that you wanted to share, any parting thoughts you wanted to share with our listeners and our viewers that could continue to help them and encourage them on their journey.
Yeah, I mean, we've said this a couple times during this podcast, but I just want to end with saying that your process is uniquely your process. And however you feel is worth paying attention to and caring for. And at the end of the day, people are going to try to be there for you. But at the end of the day, your self-compassion, your self-exploring, your self-process is the most important process. I know we need help and we need support when we go through grief, but you are going to be your most powerful advocate in this process. You're going to be the gatekeeper that allows God and others to come in. So what you do for yourself personally through this process is the most important thing.
Yeah. And it's okay for you to think about yourself and focus on yourself.
Exactly. And a lot of times people don't want to do that because they think it's selfish, especially raising kids, especially when the world's needing us. But at the end of the day, if you don't put that oxygen mask on yourself first, and you put it on your kids and you put it on other people, and you don't take care of your grieving process, you're not going to be able to help other people. If you're putting on yourself and you're not putting on if you're not putting on yourself first and you're putting on your kids, you're going to die and not be able to help your kids. So always take care of yourself first, because that's the most loving act you can do for anyone in your world.
So as a parting thought for our listeners, we would like to encourage you to go back to our past episodes. And when you're ready, again, take all the time that you need. But so much of what we've shared about processing pain relates directly to this, how you're going to process grief. Because at the end of the day, pain is pain. Whether that pain came because of a loss of a loved one or because of some other unmet need that wasn't met in your life, pain is pain. And healing and providing comfort happens in very much the same way. So you'll get a lot of rich resources and a lot of help through our to the previous episodes that we have released. Thank you everyone for joining us. And until next time, it's Brian and Laura with Triggered and True.